80s is widely viewed as a dark time for style, but honestly, it's one of my favourite fashion eras. Any decade that could inspire such excess on all fronts is immediately interesting to me, and so in this video, I'm going to explore the highs and the lows of the decade. Of course, as with all decades, there were many style subgenres, so I naturally won't be able to focus on all of them, but I'll do my best to paint an overall picture of the 1980s vibes. I'll also mainly be focusing on British and American fashion, though I'm sure there were incredible trends started elsewhere during the decade too. From spandex to power suits to mullets, the 80s gave us an incredible amount of variation. So let's delve into some of the key styles that were definitively 80s. Firstly, I'll provide a very brief overview of the cultural climate in this decade, so we can understand how many of the over-the-top trends were born. Differing from the 1960s and 70s, the 1980s was known for consumerism and materialism, with yuppie attitudes and access to quickly developing technology, making the decade feel faster and flashier than those that came before it. In the UK, the Tories were in power, with the highly controversial Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. Thatcher is known for implementing the Right to Buy scheme, helping council house tenants and those less well off to buy their homes, as well as helping to back entrepreneurial ventures. The Thatcher years saw an increase in small businesses being set up, with upwards mobility from the working and middle classes becoming increasingly possible. She also pushed for the privatisation of industries, and though many of her policies were not without repercussions, she did massively impact the British economy. People found themselves being able to move across a previously pretty impenetrable class system, and this impacted people's attitudes towards consumerism. Things became within reach that previously weren't, and we see this attitude impact the style and materialism of this decade. Across the pond, the Republicans were in power, led by President Ronald Reagan. Reagan's economic policy, becoming known as Reaganomics, brought about one of the biggest economic booms in US history. Unemployment rates and inflation rates decreased massively, and Reagan's reign is known as one run on optimism. Following the Vietnam War, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and stretches of civil unrest, Reagan looked towards a stronger, happier, wealthier America, trying to create positive opportunities for US citizens. Much like in the UK, people were able to grow financially, with consumerism booming there too. Of course, this is a massive simplification of the politics of the time, but overall, we can see how people were able to dive into this era of excess so fully. Money, technology, big hair, and big goals defined the 80s, so let's move on to talking about the style that this mindset birthed. Let's start with the yuppie image, which was tied directly to the economic booms that were happening during this time. Yuppie stands for Young Urban Professional, or Young Upwardly Mobile Professional, with a clean-cut, preppy style being associated with this term. Picture power suits, often paired with running trainers for ease of mobility for women to then be swapped out for kitten heels, pastel-coloured everything, and yacht club attire. The yuppies wanted to exude money and success, and this was evident in their clothing. The cultural climate that enabled a fast life and fast money gave rise to displays of wealth amongst the young that differed greatly from the decades prior. Gone were the days of the youths being all about free love and sticking it to the man. Instead, the youths were becoming the man. Jobs in banks and offices were becoming much more readily available, and the style reflected these roles. Shoulder-padded suit jackets, high-waisted pleated trousers, and Rolexes were all the rage during work hours, to then be swapped out on weekends spent socializing and networking. In their downtime, the yuppie types could be seen in pastel polo shirts, light wash trousers, knitwear that was often draped over their shoulders, sweater vests, and anything Giorgio Armani or Ralph Lauren. The goal was to look preppy and well-groomed, giving off an aura of accomplishment and wealth. As the decade continued, yuppie was increasingly used as a pejorative term, but until the mid-80s, the yuppies were in large supply. Optimism, opportunism, and a certain egotism were key to the image and have become indicative of the 80s money culture. Think American Psycho, The Secret of My Success, and Working Girl. Corporate culture and corporate styles were part of the zeitgeist and have gone on to determine our attitudes to professional life for years after. But, much like today, people in the 1980s weren't only interested in looking financially successful. Just as the concept of wellness rose to the mainstream a few years back, there was an exercise boom during the 80s that coincided with the popularization of athleisure wear. The 80s was certainly an era of extremes, with cocaine fueling insane work lives and workout culture allowing you to aerobicize away the bad habits. Jane Fonda and Cher were amongst the hordes of people making follow-along at-home workout videos, paving the way for fitness YouTubers nowadays. The women in these videos always looked immaculate, wearing unitards and leg warmers in a mishmash of bold colours. Spandex was the material of the moment, ideal for showing off the toned body that you were working so hard to maintain through aerobics and jazzercise. It was used to make all sorts of items, but the iconic leotard cut high on the hip is what most people think of when they hear the word. Determined to make a statement, these items often came in the boldest neon colours imaginable, with neon also becoming part and parcel of the 80s aesthetic. The decade was many things, but subtle was not one of them. In addition to the extreme bodycon styles of workout gear, we also saw the increasing popularity of the shell suits. All the big sports brands were making them in bold colours and patterns true to the 80s vibe. Made from shiny nylon, they certainly made a statement. Let's switch gears now and take a look at the styles that were directly influenced by the various music scenes that were born in the 80s. Many of the biggest style icons during this time were musicians, from Adamant to Madonna to Grace Jones. Of course, there were many music subgenres that popped up during this era, so I won't be able to cover them all, but I will try to look at those that I found to be the most influential. Firstly, let's take a look at the New Romantics movement. This movement was prominent early on in the decade and eventually faded out by the mid-80s, but it left behind a distinctive legacy. Becoming immediately identifiable by their combination of bold makeup and flamboyant clothing, the New Romantics were anything but understated. Think early Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Adamant, Eurythmics, and Boy George. The movement was the 80s answer to the 70s glam rock image. Frilly shirts, red lipstick, leather trousers, military jackets, and pirate-style clothing were all key components of the New Romantic attire, with those in the movement really leaning in to the androgyny that these outfits allowed. I find it strange nowadays to see certain stars either berated or heralded for their clothing that goes against typical gender norms, when really it's nothing that we haven't seen before. There was definitely a shift towards normcore in the 90s, but the 70s and 80s were full of people pushing gender boundaries, and the New Romantics were at the forefront of this in this decade. The decadence and drama of the 80s is perfectly exemplified in these outfits, with the movement being tied directly to the rebirth of the club scene. New Romantic bands were no stranger to the use of synths and light shows, with their image being a key component of their success. The combination of rapidly developing technology, sexual freedom, and the changing economy led to an over-the-top, glamorous image that has become a key part of 80s history. Equally as dramatic, but entirely different, the 80s also saw the popularization of hair metal bands. Being referred to as hair metal was often seen as derogatory at the time, with the bands in this movement often preferring to be categorized as glam rock instead, despite being pretty different from the glam rock bands of the decade prior. As the name hair metal suggests, the voluminous hair of the band members was a key part of their image. Both men and women had long, often permed and frequently backcombed hair, perfect for whipping around on stage for added drama. Clothes-wise, everything was as over-the-top as one could expect from any style movement birthed in this decade. I'm going to group in some bands that would be considered less hair metal and just regular metal here, as the clothing choices were often very similar. Think Bon Jovi, Guns N' Roses, Def Leppard, Vixen, Whitesnake and Quiet Riot, amongst many, many others. The uniform for these bands often consisted of some combination of leather trousers, acid-wash denim, bandanas, denim vests, wrist cuffs, and studs on absolutely everything. There was an edge but also a shininess to the hair metal band members, who were groomed to perfection with the aim of looking anything but perfect. Piling on accessories and hairspray was key, with the image cementing itself as an influential part of 80s culture. Next, let's take a look at the booming hip-hop scene that took off in this decade. Groups such as Run DMC, Public Enemy, Beastie Boys, and NWA were enormously successful and quickly garnered a cult following. Now referred to as Golden Age hip-hop, America produced some of the biggest names in this genre during this era, with many of the artists originating from New York. The hip-hop scene merged sportwear styles with luxury and excess, becoming the blueprint for many of the sport luxe styles that permeated the 1990s. Tracksuits, bucket hats, and Air Jordans were frequently worn by stars such as LL Cool J and Slick Rick, who also helped to popularize rope chains and four-finger rings. Flashiness was partnered with streetwear for hip-hop artists and fans, with no one doing this better than Dapper Dan himself. Dapper Dan is a designer from Harlem, running a store from 1982 to 1992 called Dapper Dan's Boutique. I could do a full video on his influence, but to briefly sum it up here, Dan would create knockoffs using bootlegged fabrics, introducing his clients to the world of Gucci, Fendi, and Louis Vuitton. Salt-N-Pepa and Eric B. and Rakim were amongst those that famously worked with Dapper Dan, using his pieces in their artwork and music videos. His work perfectly exemplified the crossover between casual streetwear silhouettes and the performativity of wealth that the hip-hop scene became known for, and he undoubtedly had an influence on the direction that large fashion houses have moved in since. It's now very common to see designer bucket hats, tracksuits, and costume jewellery, but Dapper Dan made it so that it was within reach. Of all the styles I've looked at so far during this video, I think it's fair to say that 80s hip-hop fashion has had the longest lasting influence in the mainstream. Though elements are dated, we've seen trends that were popularized here bleed into the subsequent decades, proving to have a staying power that shoulder pads and unitards couldn't quite manage. The last music-related style group that I'll look at today is the indie scene. The most understated of the styles looked at thus far, the indie scene was known for its appearance of nonchalance and lack of polish. This, along with the looks popularized by the hip-hop scene, has had influence that has continued until the present day, with stores such as Urban Outfitters still trying to capitalize on this vibe. A few of the key bands within this movement were the Smiths, Echo and the Bunnymen, and the Jesus and Mary chain. The aesthetic of these groups was by and large effortless, laid back, and a far cry from the costume-like outfits of the new romantics or metal fans. Politically, the indie groups were providing a counterculture to follow for those who did not feel represented by Thatcher's Britain. Despite stating earlier that Thatcher boosted the economy in many ways, her time as Prime Minister was not without its major issues. Her legacy includes highly controversial decisions, including the closure of many coal mines across England, the abolition of free milk for schoolchildren, and her role in the Falklands War. Though her policies allowed for booming yuppie culture for some, they also led to extreme hardship for others, with the indie scene leaning into the opposition for the excess and flashiness that many Brits now exhibited. Of course, not all members of the indie scene would have had this political standpoint, but we did generally see a larger working class quotient attached to this movement. I found a great article on indie style that I'll link down below, which included the quote that the look was often about communicating your shyness. Everything was understated, with the outfits often being comprised of knitwear, Doc Marten boots, jean jackets, and corduroys, usually all in muted colours. Often sourced from charity shops, this look was much more affordable than their yuppie contemporaries' outfits, allowing youths from all backgrounds to fit the aesthetic. The popularity of this style of clothing has prevailed with youths who feel as though they don't fit in or are misunderstood by their generation, often turning to Johnny Marr or Ian McCulloch for inspiration. Being one of the most wearable styles that came out of the 80s, it's not surprising that it is still seen everywhere. There are so many more style groups that I'd love to look at, but lastly, I'll just give some honourable mentions to a few key sources of inspiration. You can't think of the 1980s without thinking of John Hughes movies, with these really giving us an insight into the style at the time. Those who did not fit into a particular aesthetic and just lived in denim, Reebok trainers and a sweatshirt are well represented here. Think also back to the early seasons of Seinfeld, with Jerry really showing us what ordinary people wore. I also feel as though you can't do a video on 80s style without mentioning the iconic Princess Diana. I could do a full video on her style legacy, but to sum it up quickly here, her penchant for shoulder-padded dresses, ruffles, blue eyeliner, and of course that signature haircut really exemplified what 80s style meant. If you made it this far, thank you so much, and I'd love to know your opinion on 80s trends, and let me know which decade I should do a deep dive into next. Thanks for watching.